Every time we argued, she would hurl the word like a weapon, divorce, and I would always freeze, heart racing, unsure if this was another empty threat or the end. But that night, when she said it one last time, something in me shifted. I smiled, reached for my phone, and dialed my lawyer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the first time it happened clearly, though I wish I could forget. My name is Gabriel Ortiz, and I lived what most people would call an ordinary life in a quiet suburb of Portland. I had a decent job as a project manager at a mid-sized tech firm, a home that I'd worked hard to pay off, and what I believed was a loving marriage to my wife, Elena. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Neighbors admired us, friends envied our life, and we even had a few weekend traditions that seemed to anchor us together. But behind closed doors, a storm was quietly brewing. Elena was sharp, beautiful, and magnetic, but she had a temper that could flare without warning. At first, it seemed like passion, something that drew me in, but over the years it began to feel like a ticking time bomb in our home. I loved her fiercely, but there were moments when I began to feel like I was walking on glass, afraid that any wrong word or gesture would trigger the next eruption. I still remember the morning rituals we shared, coffee together at the small breakfast nook in our kitchen, the hum of the espresso machine filling the air, our two cats curled on the windowsill. It all seemed normal, almost idyllic, but the first real fight had been over something trivial, a miscommunication about weekend plans. I had suggested visiting my parents for Sunday lunch, something I thought would be harmless. Elena had wanted to spend the day redecorating the living room, insisting that my parents didn't really care to see us that often. The argument started calmly enough, polite disagreement turning into raised voices. And then, almost casually, she said it. "Gabriel, if you don't respect my wishes, maybe we shouldn't be married." My stomach sank. I had no idea how to respond. That was the first time I realized that the word divorce could appear not as a distant threat, but as a weapon to wield in the heat of a moment. At first, I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just her way of expressing frustration. But over time, those threats became a pattern, a constant undercurrent in our relationship. Every disagreement, no matter how small, what to eat for dinner, which route to take to a family event, whose turn it was to clean the bathroom, ended with the same word, the same tone, sharp and cutting. Divorce. At first, my reaction was panic. I felt my chest tighten, my mind racing with scenarios of life split in two, of financial ruin, of losing the woman I loved. But after the 5th, 10th, 15th time, I started noticing a strange phenomenon. The word began to lose its impact. My fear dulled into a hollow sort of numbness, a dull ache that made me wonder why I stayed in a marriage where every conflict felt like a hostage situation. I questioned myself endlessly. Was I weak? Was I the problem? Or was this simply the life I had unknowingly agreed to? Elena was not malicious in the way people imagine abusers to be. She had a sharp mind and an unyielding sense of her own logic, and in arguments she wielded it like a sword. She often made me feel that if I didn't concede, I was somehow failing her, failing us. Our friends noticed the tension but rarely commented. My parents expressed concern subtly, hinting that perhaps the constant threats were unhealthy, but they lived hours away and I felt trapped by the expectations of marriage, that it was supposed to be about endurance, patience, and sacrifice. And so I endured, biting back my frustrations, learning to smile through the tension, and waiting for the storm to pass. Our apartment, once a sanctuary, became a battlefield. The walls seemed to echo with the arguments of past months, every room a reminder of a conflict that had escalated from small annoyances to emotional warfare. I found myself walking on tiptoe, monitoring my words carefully, timing my laughter, even moderating the way I sipped my coffee, afraid that some innocuous action might ignite another threat. And yet, there were moments of tenderness, flashes of the woman I had fallen in love with, a shared joke over dinner, a late-night walk holding hands in the crisp autumn air, the way her eyes softened when she was genuinely happy. Those moments kept me tethered, gave me hope that the marriage could survive, that maybe the divorce threats were just emotional blips, not signals of collapse. But the more frequent they became, the more I realized that this wasn't just a pattern. It was a control mechanism. Elena had developed a habit of testing boundaries, asserting dominance, and seeing how far she could push before I cracked. And I did crack, repeatedly every single time. until a quiet anger began simmering beneath my fear. I started keeping notes, mentally cataloging each incident, each word, each escalation. I confided in my closest friend, Marcus, who had been married for over a decade, and he listened without judgment, offering only cautious advice. Gabriel, you need to protect yourself. Love doesn't mean giving up your peace every time someone threatens to leave. His words haunted me for weeks, replaying in my mind like a mantra I wasn't sure I was ready to embrace. By the time we reached that pivotal night, the night she shouted divorce one last time, it wasn't a surprise. It was a culmination. I had endured countless battles, survived countless emotional ambushes, and finally reached a threshold where fear no longer dictated my reactions. When Elena slammed her hands on the kitchen counter, her face flushed with fury, and said those words again, I didn't panic. I didn't plead. I simply smiled. And in that brief, electric moment, I realized that I had regained something I had long forgotten: control over my own life. After that night, I realized I had to step back and truly examine our life together. My name is Gabriel Ortiz, and while I had always seen myself as a patient and understanding husband, I had been neglecting my own emotional well-being for far too long. The moments when Elena's temper flared had become like minor earthquakes in my day-to-day life, shaking the foundation of my sense of safety and stability. I had started noticing patterns long before that final confrontation, how arguments seemed to follow the same rhythm, how her mood swings dictated the flow of our home, and how I constantly found myself apologizing for things that weren't my fault. It was subtle at first, just a shift in tone or a sharp glance that made my heart sink, but over the years, these moments compounded, and I realized I was living in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for the next verbal explosion. I loved her, yes, but love had become a cage rather than a sanctuary. The first thing I did was try to understand myself in the context of our relationship. I began journaling at night, scribbling down every argument, every instance where the threat of divorce had been used, and the emotions that surged within me each time. Writing became a mirror, reflecting the anxiety, frustration, and resignation that I had been bottling up. I started seeing a pattern emerge. Elena's outbursts were not random. They were triggered by moments when I asserted my own desires, small things like wanting to attend a weekend workshop for work, suggesting a new vacation plan, or even choosing a different restaurant than she had in mind. Each time, she would escalate the situation to the ultimate threat, and I would shrink under it. But now, with the journal in front of me, I realized that this wasn't just about disagreements. It was about power, control, and emotional leverage. And for the first time, I acknowledged that fear had been guiding my decisions for years. I also began confiding more openly with close friends and colleagues. My coworker, Lila, had always been someone I trusted, and when I shared pieces of my story, she didn't offer cliches or easy solutions. She listened, really listened, and pointed out things I had been blind to. That no amount of compromise should come at the cost of my peace of mind. That emotional threats were a form of manipulation, and that taking action was not only justified but necessary. Her words resonated deeply, and I felt a flicker of validation that had been missing for years. My parents were supportive as well, albeit gently. They had always worried about the strain in our marriage but had never wanted to interfere directly. Now they encouraged me to consider options I had been too scared to explore, reminding me that love should not feel like walking on a tightrope over an endless void. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As I reflected on my life, I also recognized how our environment had shaped the dynamic. Our home, once a place of warmth and comfort, had slowly become a landscape of tension. The living room, where we used to binge-watch movies together, now carried the silent weight of unspoken resentments. The kitchen, once a space for shared laughter over cooking, was now where arguments ignited most often, every corner a potential battleground. Even our neighborhood, quiet and serene, seemed to mock me with its normalcy, a reminder that from the outside everything looked fine, while inside I was living in constant anxiety. This awareness was painful but necessary. It was the foundation I needed to recognize that change had to start within me before it could happen externally. I began researching strategies for managing relationships where emotional manipulation was present, I read about assertive communication, boundaries, and the psychological impact of repeated threats. I discovered that consistent exposure to fear and manipulation can erode self-esteem, distort perception, and create a sense of helplessness. This realization was both sobering and empowering. I understood that my love for Elena did not mean I had to accept being constantly undermined or terrified. I could still care for her while refusing to sacrifice my own mental and emotional well-being. It was a delicate distinction, one that required careful thought and deliberate planning. During this period of introspection, I also noticed small but important shifts in myself. I started asserting my preferences in minor ways, choosing the music in the car, suggesting weekend activities, even deciding on my own dinner plans without preemptive apologies. The first few times were nerve-wracking. I could almost feel Elena bracing for a reaction, as if expecting me to cave, but I didn't. I held my ground quietly, steadily, and to my surprise, nothing catastrophic occurred. This gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. It was a subtle but profound transformation, proof that I could reclaim agency over my life without triggering immediate chaos. I also began preparing for practical steps, thinking ahead to the night when I would no longer be passive. I researched legal processes, understood my rights, and even consulted a lawyer anonymously to explore my options. I was not planning impulsive action. Instead, I was equipping myself with knowledge, a shield against uncertainty and fear. Knowing the steps I could take made me feel stronger and less dependent on the unpredictable tides of our arguments. It was as though a fog had lifted, revealing the landscape of choices I had ignored for far too long. Finally, I took time to reconnect with the parts of my life that Elena's constant volatility had overshadowed. I began running again, waking up early to jog along the Willamette River, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, the water shimmering in the morning light. I started reading books I had neglected, focusing on personal growth and resilience. These activities were small but vital. They reminded me that I existed outside of the marriage, that my identity and happiness were not wholly contingent on Elena's moods or threats. It was a crucial realization, one that strengthened my resolve for the days ahead. By the end of those weeks of reflection, research, and quiet assertion, I felt a shift that was more than emotional. It was psychological. I no longer feared Elena's outbursts in the same way. I no longer doubted my ability to protect myself. And most importantly, I understood that the life I wanted, peaceful, autonomous, and grounded in respect, was still attainable, even if it meant making the hardest choices of my life. That was the calm before the storm, the period of preparation and clarity that would make my next actions deliberate and unshakable. The mornings in our house had started to feel different after that period of reflection. Even though Elena still carried herself with the same intensity, I noticed that my own posture, my tone, and my demeanor had shifted. I was calmer, more deliberate, and no longer waiting for the next argument like a soldier bracing for an ambush. Instead, I moved through the rooms with quiet confidence, focusing on what I could control rather than reacting impulsively to her unpredictable moods. My friends began noticing subtle changes in me, too. Marcus, my longtime friend from college, remarked one evening over a beer, "Gabriel, you seem lighter. Not like you're happy, exactly, but like you're not waiting to be knocked down every 5 minutes." And he was right. I wasn't necessarily happy yet, but I was no longer captive to fear, which felt like freedom in itself. It wasn't long before the old dynamics reappeared, though. Arguments didn't disappear overnight, and Elena's sharp tongue still had its moments of fury. One night, we disagreed over something seemingly trivial, the placement of our new living room rug. She wanted it perfectly aligned with the couch. I preferred a slightly angled arrangement that I felt made the space feel warmer. She stormed into the room, hands on hips, face flushed, and immediately launched into a tirade about how I never cared about her opinions or our home. I listened, silent, letting her vent, and for the first time, I didn't flinch or interrupt. I had practiced breathing techniques, grounding myself with the sensation of the floor beneath my feet and the sound of her voice, reminding myself that I was not powerless. Her words hit the air, sharp as knives, but I didn't react the way I had for years. No panic, no apology, no frantic attempts to placate. I simply stood there and waited until her energy waned. And then, of course, the words came. The word that had haunted me for years. The weapon she had wielded in every previous conflict. Divorce. My stomach didn't twist in fear. My heart didn't race uncontrollably. Instead, I felt the strange mixture of exhaustion and determination settle over me like a cloak. In that moment, I realized that this was the culmination of everything: the countless fights, the sleepless nights, the journaling, the counseling advice, the quiet reclaiming of my own agency. This was the night where I could no longer allow myself to be controlled by a single word, repeated over and over as if it had the power to dictate my life. I smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, and said, "Elena, I think it's time we both get some clarity." I turned, walked to my office, and picked up my phone. I didn't dial her number, I dialed my lawyer's office. I had taken the time to prepare, to understand the process, to identify my options, and to ensure that the steps I was about to take were deliberate rather than reactive. The lawyer's receptionist answered, calm and professional, and within minutes, I had scheduled a consultation for the following morning. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel guilt. I felt an odd mixture of relief and resolve. I had finally crossed the threshold from passive endurance to active decision-making, from living under the shadow of someone else's threats to reclaiming control over my own life. The night passed slowly after that, not because of tension, but because my mind was buzzing with possibilities. I replayed the fights in my head, examined the timeline of our conflicts, and considered the emotional landscape that had brought us to this point. It was like looking at a map after being lost in a forest for years. Suddenly, the paths were visible, and I could choose which direction to take. I realized that every warning sign I had ignored, every subtle manipulation, every moment I had suppressed my own voice, all of it had led me here, to a place where I could finally act with intention. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of alignment between my heart, my mind, and my actions. The following morning, I arrived at the lawyer's office early. The walls smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning created a calm atmosphere. The lawyer, a woman named Sofia Martinez, greeted me warmly and asked me to sit down. I had prepared all my notes, printed documents, and a timeline of events in our marriage. I explained the pattern of emotional manipulation, the repeated threats, and the way I had been systematically conditioned to respond in fear. Sophia listened attentively, taking notes, and then explained my rights, options, and potential strategies. She emphasized that while the decision to proceed with legal action was significant, it was also my right to protect myself and ensure that my mental, emotional, and financial well-being were safeguarded. I left the office feeling empowered rather than defeated, with a clear plan and an understanding that I was no longer alone in this journey. Returning home, I felt the familiar tension of our apartment, but with a new perspective. I no longer perceived it as an inescapable battlefield, but as a space where I could exercise agency. Elena was already in the living room, scrolling through her phone, unaware of the internal transformation that had occurred over the past weeks. I greeted her calmly, without pretense, and went about my day. Every small interaction, from the way I poured coffee to the way I answered her questions, was deliberate, measured, and grounded in self-assuredness. She could sense the difference, though she didn't comment immediately. The shift in my demeanor was subtle but palpable, and I knew that the next argument would test this newfound equilibrium. By the time evening came, I understood that the journey was far from over. Elena's threats would likely continue, and the emotional turbulence we had endured for years wasn't something that vanished overnight. But I also knew that I had crossed an invisible line, from reactive to proactive, from fear-driven to empowered. I had taken steps to protect myself, to define my boundaries, and to reclaim my voice. And as I went to bed that night, the city lights flickering through the blinds, I felt a rare sense of anticipation rather than dread. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for disaster. I was waiting for clarity, resolution, and the chance to finally step into a life defined by my own choices. The next few weeks marked a subtle but profound shift in our household dynamics. While Elena remained the same in outward appearance, sharp, exacting, and passionate, her usual dominance over our interactions began to meet a quiet resistance from me. I discovered that the more I acted from a place of calm assertion rather than fear, the less power her threats seemed to carry. I began noticing how our interactions, once a constant minefield of tension, could now be navigated with measured words and controlled energy. It wasn't about confrontation or defiance. It was about reclaiming the sense of agency that had been eroded over years of repeated emotional manipulation. My morning routines became sacred rituals of preparation. Before stepping out of the bedroom, I would breathe deeply, review my intentions for the day, and remind myself that my peace was not negotiable. Even the simplest gestures, pouring coffee, responding to a question, were now deliberate acts of self-assuredness, a quiet rebellion against the fear that had long governed my life. One evening, Elena attempted to reignite an old pattern over a dispute about finances. We had been discussing household expenses, a topic that often turned into a battle over control and accountability. In the past, any disagreement over money would escalate quickly, leading to raised voices, accusations, and, inevitably, the dreaded word, divorce. This time, however, I listened intently, calmly analyzing her concerns without interruption. I acknowledged her perspective without apology for my own reasoning. I presented my points clearly and without defensiveness, focusing on facts rather than emotion. She blinked in surprise, her usual script faltering for the first time in years. When she uttered the word divorce, it no longer struck fear into my chest. Instead, it was almost like background noise, a familiar echo that no longer dictated my reactions. I simply nodded, maintaining a steady tone, and said, "We'll find a solution, but threats don't help." Her eyes widened, a mixture of frustration and disbelief, and for the first time, I sensed that the dynamics in our marriage could be fundamentally altered by my own self-possession. Around this period, I also sought emotional support outside the home. I met with a counselor named Dr. Renee Latham, who specialized in relationships characterized by manipulation and control. She provided a safe space to articulate fears, frustrations, and unprocessed emotions that had accumulated over years. Through our sessions, I realized how much of my energy had been expended on anticipating Elena's reactions, rather than living authentically. Dr. Latham helped me understand that emotional threats in a marriage were not only unhealthy, but could also be classified as coercive control, a realization that validated my long-suppressed feelings. I began practicing assertiveness exercises and boundary-setting techniques, both of which fortified my sense of self. Each session left me feeling more grounded, more prepared, and increasingly capable of handling confrontation without succumbing to fear. Outside the home, my personal life flourished in ways I had neglected. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in months, sometimes years. There were evenings spent at small cafes discussing dreams, ambitions, and shared experiences that reminded me of life beyond the confines of my marriage. I picked up hobbies that had been abandoned: painting, long-distance running, even volunteering at a local animal shelter. Each act of engagement with the outside world was a reaffirmation that my identity was not solely defined by Elena's moods or the volatile environment of our apartment. I discovered that autonomy, once dormant, could coexist with the emotional complexity of a strained marriage. These small victories, often unnoticed by others, accumulated and became a bedrock for the courage I would need in the coming weeks. Of course, life was not without its challenges. There were moments when Elena's intensity escalated unpredictably, when her voice would pierce the calm I had cultivated, when past fears threatened to resurface. During one particularly tense evening, she accused me of being emotionally distant, of plotting behind her back, of undermining our relationship. In years past, these accusations would have sent me into panic, apologizing, rationalizing, and attempting to placate her to avoid the inevitable divorce declaration. This time, I remained silent initially, allowing her to speak her frustrations fully. Once she had expended her energy, I responded not with defensiveness but with reasoned clarity. I acknowledged her feelings without internalizing blame, and I made clear the boundaries I had established for my own well-being. The exchange was tense, but it ended without the usual escalation, a small yet monumental victory in reclaiming equilibrium. I also began documenting our interactions with more intentionality, not in a way to weaponize, but as a means of clarity, tracking incidents, noting patterns, and reflecting on emotional triggers. This process was methodical and deliberate, providing both evidence and perspective. It allowed me to see our marriage through a lens unclouded by anxiety, to differentiate between constructive dialogue and manipulative behavior. With each note I took, I felt more prepared to navigate future conflicts and more confident in my ability to assert my own needs without succumbing to fear. It was a form of quiet empowerment, a shield that bolstered my resolve even when the storms of argument threatened to sweep through our home. By the end of this period, I could see the contours of a new reality. I was no longer reacting purely out of fear. I was responding with strategy, patience, and self-assurance. The air in the apartment felt less oppressive. Even when arguments occurred, Elena's presence was still commanding, her voice still sharp. But I had cultivated the internal fortitude to withstand the familiar threat of divorce without losing my sense of self. I realized that change in our relationship would not come solely from her, but from the way I navigated the space between us, the boundaries I enforced, and the deliberate choices I made each day. It was a slow, incremental process, but the foundation for meaningful transformation had been laid. In this stage of reflection, preparation, and incremental assertiveness, I began to understand that the climax of our marital struggle was approaching. The final confrontation, the moment that would demand my full courage, clarity, and resolve, was inevitable. But for the first time, I felt equipped. I was no longer the man who cowered at the mention of a threat. I was a man who had rebuilt his sense of agency, reclaimed his voice, and prepared for the decisive moment when fear would finally lose its grip over my life. The good times we had once shared now served as reminders of what had been at stake, while the preparation I had undertaken ensured that I would face the coming storm with deliberate strength rather than panic. The first warning signs that things were about to reach a breaking point appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, but I could feel the tension coiling tighter around us with every passing day. Even though I had spent weeks reclaiming my composure and establishing boundaries, Elena had begun to test them, probing the limits of my newfound calm. It started with small remarks disguised as casual observations. "You've changed," she would say, her tone casual but edged with something sharp. "I wonder what else you're hiding from me." In the past, I would have scrambled to reassure her, to explain myself endlessly, to soothe her suspicion, but now I simply acknowledged the words without panic. "I'm not hiding anything," I would say quietly. "I just want us to communicate more clearly." The deflection was enough to stall her, and for a few days equilibrium seemed restored. But beneath the surface, I could sense the storm building, an invisible pressure that would soon demand a decisive confrontation. The escalation began to take shape during our weekend routines, moments that had once been predictable and calm. Elena started critiquing every small decision I made, from what I wore to how I planned errands, escalating minor frustrations into larger arguments. One Saturday morning, she pointedly remarked that my choice of jogging shoes was ridiculous, suggesting that I didn't care about appearances or about how she felt we were perceived as a couple. I felt the old anxiety flare, a reflexive heartbeat of panic that I had trained myself to recognize. But this time, I noticed the sensation without allowing it to dictate my behavior. I explained my reasoning calmly, emphasizing practicality rather than aesthetics, and then continued with my morning routine, neither apologizing unnecessarily nor backing down. She frowned, but didn't escalate further that day, a small victory in the long battle to maintain personal agency. As the week progressed, the warning signs became more pointed and emotionally charged. She began to introduce hypotheticals into conversations, testing how I might respond to threats of separation or legal action. "What if we just split everything tomorrow?" she asked during a quiet dinner, trying to provoke panic in me. My first instinct in past years would have been to freeze, to plead, to beg her to reconsider, but now I was prepared. I maintained eye contact, my voice steady, and replied, "We don't need hypotheticals to communicate. Let's focus on the present and how we can handle things respectfully." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of all the preparation, all the self-reflection, all the counseling sessions, and all the research I had done in the weeks prior. For the first time, I felt that I could meet her manipulation with reason rather than fear. It wasn't just verbal cues anymore. The warning signs began to appear in her behavior as well. She started staying up late at night, pacing the apartment, leaving notes with passive-aggressive messages, and sending a barrage of texts in the early hours, often questioning my loyalty or intentions. I recognized these as attempts to destabilize me emotionally, to provoke a reaction that I had historically provided. Instead, I implemented the techniques I had learned, pausing before responding, maintaining clarity in my language, and refusing to engage in circular arguments. It was exhausting in its own way, but I could feel a sense of strength growing with each interaction where I remained unflappable. I was building emotional armor, layer by layer, in preparation for the inevitable climax of this cycle. Even my social environment began reflecting the strain. Friends who previously had been casual about our arguments started noticing changes, subtle behaviors that I had once masked. I confided in my colleague Lila, who reminded me that repeated threats of divorce, even when not followed through, were a form of psychological manipulation. Her validation was important because it reinforced my own observations, confirming that the patterns I had endured for years were not normal or acceptable. I felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief in finally acknowledging the truth, anger at how long it had taken for me to fully recognize the depth of the manipulation. By midweek, the warning signs had escalated to clear ultimatums. Elena began using threats of divorce not as an emotional release, but as a direct tool to influence my behavior. She would say things like, "If you don't do this my way, maybe we should just end this," pairing the words with a piercing gaze that I had learned to read after years of experience. In the past, I would have felt panic tighten around my chest like a vice. Now I felt a strange sense of detachment, an observer of the situation rather than a captive of it. I had prepared for this exact scenario. I reminded myself that fear no longer had control over me, that the resources I had accumulated, the legal advice, the counseling insights, and the internal work, were tools I could use if necessary. The first concrete warning came one evening when she escalated a minor disagreement about weekend plans into a full-blown argument. Elena accused me of hiding my true intentions, questioning my dedication to the marriage, and then, with deliberate emphasis, dropped the ultimate warning. "Gabriel, if you don't prove you care the way I want, I might just leave." She said it as if the threat were a scalpel cutting through the calm I had cultivated, and yet I remained centered. I acknowledged her frustration, explained my perspective calmly, and set clear boundaries. Her intensity persisted for a few moments, but she eventually paused, recognizing, perhaps unconsciously, that my fear-driven responses were no longer available to exploit. By the end of the week, I realized that the warning signs were not merely indicators of impending conflict, but signals that a final confrontation was approaching. They had intensified in frequency, volume, and emotional impact, yet I felt a new confidence in my ability to navigate them. I understood that these moments were tests, designed to provoke panic or compliance, and that my response would define the trajectory of the coming storm. The stage was set, the tension palpable, and I felt ready. I had passed the threshold from passive endurance to conscious preparedness, and now, the decisions I would make in the coming days would determine the fate of our marriage and my own peace of mind. The escalation of problems was undeniable, and by this stage it had reached a point where every day felt like a strategic exercise in emotional navigation. Elena's behavior was no longer simply sharp or reactive. It had taken on a deliberate intensity, a pattern designed to unnerve and destabilize me. Minor disagreements erupted into full-blown confrontations, and the familiar weapon, the threat of divorce, became a recurring drumbeat echoing through our home. What had once been a baseline fear now presented itself as a calculated test, and I recognized the stakes clearly. This was the culmination of years of manipulation, testing my limits, and seeing how much I could endure before breaking. My internal preparation over the past weeks became my shield, allowing me to face each confrontation with a calm I had never previously achieved. The difference was striking. Instead of reacting with panic or pleading, I responded with clarity, measured reasoning, and an unwavering sense of self-possession. One afternoon, the catalyst for a major escalation occurred over something that should have been trivial, the planning of a family dinner for my parents' anniversary. Elena had envisioned an elaborate arrangement, insisting on a precise seating chart, specific menu items, and a detailed schedule for the evening. I suggested a more relaxed approach, one that emphasized enjoyment and connection rather than rigid formality. She immediately seized upon my suggestion as evidence of disregard, launching into an intense critique of my character, accusing me of being selfish, uncaring, and incapable of prioritizing family. As she spoke, I could feel the familiar rush of anxiety in my chest, a reflexive heartbeat that had once dominated my responses. But this time I acknowledged the sensation without succumbing to it. I listened, validated her feelings without internalizing blame, and calmly articulated my reasoning. The exchange lasted for over an hour, a sustained test of patience and composure, yet I maintained a steady presence, refusing to give her the reaction she had historically sought. It wasn't just verbal escalation anymore. Elena began asserting control in ways that affected our shared routines and environment. She would rearrange household items to demonstrate dominance, monitor my interactions with friends and colleagues, and question every decision I made with pointed scrutiny. Each action was a subtle form of coercion, designed to undermine my confidence and induce compliance. I recognized the pattern for what it was and responded by reinforcing boundaries, asserting autonomy in small but significant ways. If she questioned my schedule, I calmly explained it. If she attempted to dictate interactions with friends, I maintained transparency without defensiveness. These acts were quiet revolutions, each one chipping away at the old dynamic of fear and compliance that had long defined our marriage. The escalation reached a personal dimension as well. Elena began making accusations about my intentions, loyalty, and emotional availability, often in front of friends or family, which amplified the pressure. I remember one particular instance at a casual dinner with mutual friends where she insinuated that I had been secretly planning to undermine her authority in the home. The statement was delivered with precision, designed to embarrass and provoke. In previous years, I would have felt my stomach twist with panic, perhaps even leaving the room to avoid further confrontation. This time, I remained composed, addressing the accusation calmly and respectfully, ensuring that my response neither escalated the situation nor ceded control to fear. The outcome was unexpected. Elena, momentarily disarmed, faltered in her delivery, revealing the cracks in the manipulative pattern she had maintained for years. As the days went by, the escalation manifested in more aggressive psychological tactics. She began tracking my personal habits, critiquing the timing of routines, and making veiled threats about the future of our home and finances. Each incident was a test, designed to provoke a reaction of fear or submission. But I had prepared meticulously for this stage. I leaned on the strategies I had developed with Dr. Renee Latham, including grounding techniques, assertive communication, and emotional distancing. Every challenge was met with observation and clarity, and while the tension in the apartment was palpable, I no longer felt trapped by it. Each interaction reinforced the principle that I could remain present, assert boundaries, and protect my emotional stability despite external pressures. Interestingly, the escalation also brought clarity about our relationship. I could see, more distinctly than ever, the cyclical nature of our conflicts. Minor disagreements escalating into ultimatums, emotional manipulation becoming predictable, and threats functioning as control mechanisms rather than genuine expressions of intent. Recognizing this pattern allowed me to anticipate and navigate interactions with precision. I was no longer reacting blindly. I was observing, analyzing, and choosing responses that aligned with my well-being rather than submitting to ingrained fear. This shift was subtle but powerful, creating a buffer between provocation and reaction that fundamentally changed the dynamic between us. Amidst the tension, I also began laying practical groundwork for long-term security. I organized financial documents, revisited legal advice, and explored logistical considerations for potential separation. This preparation was not a signal of surrender, but a deliberate exercise in empowerment. Knowing my rights and understanding the structural framework of potential outcomes provided a stabilizing effect, allowing me to face daily escalations with confidence. It was a paradoxical sense of security. The more she attempted to control and intimidate, the more I fortified myself with knowledge, clarity, and intentional action. By the end of this period, it was evident that the escalation was reaching its peak. Arguments were no longer intermittent. They had become sustained, emotionally charged encounters that tested every ounce of patience, composure, and resilience I had cultivated. Yet, despite the intensity, I felt a remarkable shift within myself. The panic and paralysis that had once accompanied her threats were replaced with observation, analysis, and the capacity to act deliberately when the right moment arrived. The escalation, rather than breaking me, had sharpened my awareness and strengthened my resolve. I understood, perhaps more than ever, that the coming confrontation would be decisive, and I was ready to face it fully equipped with preparation, clarity, and an unshakable commitment to my own well-being. During this stage, external validation and support became a critical lifeline, reinforcing the insights and preparations I had been cultivating. Even though I had been slowly reclaiming control over my own reactions and establishing boundaries within our home, the acknowledgement and perspectives of those outside the marriage helped solidify my understanding that the dynamic with Elena was unhealthy, and that my feelings were valid. It started with casual conversations with friends, who began noticing the subtle changes in my demeanor and the increasing tension at home. One evening, my coworker and close friend, Lila, invited me to a quiet dinner and listened as I recounted yet another tense interaction. She didn't offer simple platitudes or judgment. She observed patterns I hadn't fully articulated, pointed out the repetitive nature of Elena's threats, and reminded me that consistent emotional intimidation was not normal, even in high-stress relationships. Her words were a lifeline, a mirror that reflected back to me, a truth I had long suspected but struggled to name. In addition to friends, family members began offering their support in practical and emotional ways. My younger sister, Daniela, who had always been a keen observer of people's behavior, called me one evening after noticing my withdrawn state in a family video chat. She expressed concern not as an outsider with only partial understanding, but as someone who had witnessed patterns of subtle manipulation over years. Daniela's validation was different. It was intimate, precise, and affirming, reminding me that my instincts and feelings had not been misguided. She reinforced that reclaiming control over my emotional well-being was not a betrayal of love, but a necessary act of self-preservation. Their acknowledgement helped me recognize that I had been navigating this storm largely in isolation, and that I did not need to face it alone. Professional support also played a pivotal role. Dr. Renee Latham, my counselor, had become an essential anchor during this time. Each session built upon the last, focusing on strategies to reinforce emotional boundaries, techniques for responding to provocation without triggering escalation, and methods to maintain calm amid high-stakes confrontations. She emphasized the importance of recognizing manipulative behavior as distinct from genuine conflict and encouraged me to develop a proactive approach rather than merely reactive survival strategies. Her insights crystallized my understanding that this marriage, as it had evolved over years, operated on a foundation of control and fear rather than mutual respect. That recognition, paired with concrete strategies for asserting myself, was transformative. I began to feel the solid grounding of preparation beneath me, a psychological stability that enabled me to face the upcoming confrontations without being derailed by panic or anxiety. Support came in subtle ways as well, in moments that were almost incidental but carried profound weight. A neighbor, someone I had only interacted with occasionally in passing, noticed my stressed demeanor and offered a listening ear when we bumped into each other at a community event. Though their perspective was limited, they confirmed through their own observations that the tension in my household was affecting my overall well-being. These seemingly minor affirmations added up, creating a network of validation that made it increasingly clear that the anxiety and fear I had felt for years were not merely my imagination, but responses to consistent external pressure. At work, I found similar reinforcement. My manager, a perceptive and empathetic woman named Carla, noticed subtle changes in my energy and focus. I confided in her to a limited extent, sharing that personal stress was affecting my concentration. She responded not with pity, but with practical advice, encouraging me to establish boundaries and reminding me that prioritizing my mental health was not a weakness. Her perspective reinforced what I had already begun to internalize, that protecting oneself, even in the context of love or marriage, was a necessary and justified choice. I felt increasingly emboldened by these confirmations, sensing that my strategies for self-preservation were both appropriate and sustainable. The accumulation of external validation had a profound effect on my confidence. Whereas previously, I had doubted my perceptions and constantly questioned whether I was overreacting, now I had repeated confirmation that my feelings were justified and that the patterns of manipulation were real. These affirmations did more than bolster my resolve. They changed the internal narrative I had carried for years. Instead of seeing myself as the problem or the passive victim, I began to view my responses as deliberate, measured, and rational. The knowledge that others recognized and supported my perspective empowered me to maintain composure and act with intentionality during every interaction with Elena. By this point, the feedback loop from external validation, professional guidance, and personal reflection created a form of armor. I no longer felt isolated in my struggle. The voices of friends, family, and experts reminded me consistently that my instincts were accurate and that I had the right and ability to act in my own best interest. I began to understand that the culmination of our conflict, the ultimate confrontation that would test every ounce of preparation, courage, and resolve, was approaching. And though I knew the intensity of that moment would be significant, The network of validation I had assembled ensured that I would not face it alone. I could rely on evidence, on advice, on perspectives outside my marriage to reinforce my judgment and strengthen my resolve. By the end of this period, it was clear to me that external support had not only validated my experiences but also amplified my confidence in pursuing decisive action. Every conversation, every piece of advice, every observation from trusted individuals became part of a scaffold supporting my ability to respond strategically and with clarity. I felt no rush, no desperation, only the quiet assurance that when the final confrontation came, I would be prepared, emotionally, practically, and psychologically, to reclaim control over my life and assert the boundaries I had worked so diligently to define. The stage was set, the foundation fortified, and the moment of clarity that had been building for years was approaching with unmistakable certainty. The breaking point arrived with a force I could not have imagined, though in hindsight, it had been steadily approaching for months. Every subtle manipulation, every argument that escalated into threats, every moment of pressure had been building toward this singular moment where denial was no longer an option, and clarity became unavoidable. It was a Sunday evening, late enough that fatigue hung in the air, and I had been sitting quietly in the living room going over some notes for work. Elena entered with a restlessness that immediately put me on alert. She paced the room, speaking in clipped tones about frustrations with her day, but I could feel the undercurrent. The storm was brewing, and it would not be diffused by passive listening. She circled closer and finally dropped her familiar refrain with a venom that was sharper than ever before. Maybe we should just get divorced. Maybe this whole marriage was a mistake. In the past, those words had cut into me like a blade, sparking panic and a desperate scramble to salvage what I thought could still be saved. But that night, something inside me shifted. Rather than fear, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me, as though all the preparation, all the validation, all the moments of clarity from friends, family, and therapy had aligned to deliver me to this exact point. I set down the papers in my hand, looked her squarely in the eye, and for the first time I did not react with pleading or defense. Instead, I let silence carry the weight of my response. The silence stretched long enough that she grew unsettled, repeating the words with more aggression. But by then, I knew. This was not just another fight. This was the last straw, the undeniable confirmation that our marriage had devolved into a cycle of threats and manipulation that could no longer sustain itself. The realization hit me with a mix of sadness and liberation. I mourned in that instant the years spent hoping, bending, and contorting myself to avoid these very threats. I grieved the version of myself who had believed that love alone could outweigh toxicity. But more than anything, I felt liberated. The mask had slipped completely, and there was no ambiguity left. Divorce had not been presented as a mutual recognition of incompatibility, but as a weapon, brandished one too many times until its edge dulled against the armor I had built. The fear that had once defined me was gone, replaced by clarity so sharp it was almost exhilarating. I realized that I no longer had to dread those words, because I was ready to embrace them, to transform them from a threat into a doorway out of the cycle. That night marked the rock-bottom moment, the absolute end of denial. For years, I had rationalized Elena's threats as expressions of frustration, telling myself that everyone said things they didn't mean in anger. I had told myself that love was supposed to endure trials, that marriage meant persevering even through storms of cruelty. But as she stood before me, repeating the same ultimatum with increasing venom, I could no longer lie to myself. This was not love, it was control. And what I had mistaken for loyalty was, in truth, fear. The final straw had been laid bare. I could not, and would not, remain in a marriage where my partner's primary tool of communication was the promise of abandonment. When I finally spoke, my words were steady, and even I was surprised at how natural they sounded. If that's truly what you want, then maybe it's time we both faced it. Elena's face froze, the anger faltering just for a second, replaced by something like shock. For years, she had wielded divorce as a threat, never expecting me to accept it, never believing that I would actually take her words seriously. But in that moment, I had turned the dynamic on its head. I had taken the sting from her weapon and reshaped it into my path to freedom. She tried to regain control, raising her voice, demanding I explain myself, accusing me of giving up too easily. But her words no longer had the power they once did. Each accusation slid past me, like water off stone, irrelevant against the clarity of my decision. Internally, I could feel the weight of years lifting off me. The rock bottom was paradoxically a place of release. It wasn't despair. It was truth. I recognized that the fear of loss, which had kept me tethered to this cycle, was an illusion. What I feared losing had already been gone for years: trust, respect, and genuine partnership. Realizing that allowed me to look at her tirade without the old desperation. I could see it for what it was: noise, a desperate attempt to hold on to control, even as it slipped away. The days that followed cemented the reality of that moment. Elena alternated between anger and attempts at reconciliation, as if testing whether my resolve would crumble under pressure or guilt. She promised to change, then accused me of cruelty for even considering separation. She cried one night, insisting that her threats were never serious, just emotional outbursts. But none of it moved me. Rock bottom had stripped away illusions, and I could no longer pretend. I wasn't responding out of anger or revenge. I was responding out of clarity, out of the realization that my dignity and peace were no longer negotiable. That Sunday night, in our quiet living room filled with tension and unspoken history, I had finally reached the moment where hope transformed into determination. It was the point at which the cycle could no longer continue, where the endless threats no longer inspired fear but action. It was the lowest point of our marriage, and yet, in the clarity of that moment, it became the foundation for something greater: my freedom. The decision to take action was both terrifying and liberating, a paradox that I had been preparing for over months of reflection, support, and observation. After that final confrontation, it became undeniable. I could no longer allow fear to dictate my life, nor could I continue in a relationship where ultimatums and emotional manipulation had replaced trust and respect. The morning after Elena's ultimatum, I sat at the kitchen table with a calm focus I had not felt in years, reviewing the details I had meticulously prepared: financial records, legal documents, counseling notes, and a clear timeline of our interactions. Every piece of preparation was a reinforcement of my clarity, a scaffold to support the decisions I was about to make. I wasn't acting out of revenge or anger. I was acting to reclaim the life I had lost over years of compliance and fear. I began by reaching out to my lawyer, Sophia Martinez, who had guided me through the practical steps needed to assert my autonomy. Scheduling meetings, discussing contingencies, and understanding the legal implications felt oddly empowering. The act of organizing, of moving from contemplation to practical steps, reinforced the internal shift I had experienced. I was no longer a passive participant in the story of my own life. Every call, every document prepared, every piece of evidence reviewed gave me a renewed sense of control. For the first time, I felt aligned, emotionally, mentally, and strategically. It was not a victory over Elena, but a victory over the fear that had long imprisoned me. That afternoon, I initiated a conversation with Elena, this time with deliberate intention. I spoke calmly, laying out the boundaries that had been violated over years of arguments, the pattern of threats that had defined our interactions, and the steps I had taken to protect myself and prepare for the future. Her initial reaction was disbelief, then anger, then an almost desperate attempt to manipulate the situation, claiming she had never intended her threats seriously. I listened without interruption, maintaining composure. I did not argue, I did not plead, and I did not seek validation. I simply stated my position clearly, calmly, and without equivocation. The patterns had to end, and I would no longer allow fear to guide my choices. The execution of this decision was as much internal as it was external. At home, I began implementing boundaries in ways I had never dared before. I limited unnecessary interactions that triggered conflict, communicated in structured, purposeful ways, and disengaged from the emotional manipulation that had previously drained me. For the first time, I felt a sense of control over my own space and time. I prioritized my well-being, from the meals I prepared to the time I allocated for self-care, social connection, and reflection. Even when Elena attempted to provoke me with familiar ultimatums, I responded not with fear, but with calm acknowledgement and unwavering resolve. The energy that had once fueled anxiety and submission was now redirected toward empowerment and practical action. Social and professional support continued to play a pivotal role in this phase. Friends, family, and colleagues provided guidance, reassurance, and accountability, reinforcing that my actions were both justified and necessary. Each external perspective reinforced the internal transformation I had undergone. That reclaiming agency was not betrayal, but self-preservation. Counseling sessions helped me process emotions, recognize triggers, and maintain clarity amid the emotional intensity of daily life. I learned that execution was not merely about legal steps or strategic actions, but about the sustained practice of boundaries, emotional self-regulation, and deliberate engagement in daily life. As the days passed, the weight of years spent in fear and manipulation began to lift. I noticed small but profound differences. The quiet moments of solitude felt restorative rather than isolating. Decisions about finances, social engagements, and personal time were made with confidence rather than hesitation. Interactions with Elena, though still challenging, were no longer controlling my sense of self. I had cultivated a resilience that allowed me to engage with the world intentionally, without being hijacked by old patterns. Each day of consistent action reinforced the new dynamic. I was no longer the man who reacted out of fear, but a man who acted from clarity, self-respect, and foresight. Finally, the new beginning arrived in both subtle and unmistakable ways. Elena's attempts to provoke or intimidate gradually lost their potency. While the ultimate outcome of our marriage remained uncertain, the energy in our home shifted. I could navigate conversations without fear, manage conflicts without panic, and maintain personal integrity even in the face of provocation. Life outside the marriage, time with friends, hobbies, professional achievements, took on renewed meaning, no longer overshadowed by a constant undercurrent of threat. The peace I had long sought was not external or dependent on her behavior, but internal, rooted in my own actions, choices, and clarity. In reflection, the wisdom gained through this journey was profound. I realized that emotional threats and manipulation are not expressions of love, but tools of control that erode dignity, autonomy, and well-being over time. Recognizing the patterns, preparing strategically, and asserting boundaries with clarity are essential to reclaiming one's life from cycles of fear. Freedom and self-respect do not require confrontation or aggression. They require courage, preparation, and the deliberate decision to act in alignment with one's values. I also understood that support systems, friends, family, and professional guidance are invaluable in validating perceptions, providing perspective, and reinforcing the courage needed to make decisive change. As I moved forward, each decision, each step was deliberate, reinforcing a life no longer dictated by fear. The lessons were universal. When threats become habitual, when respect is eroded, and when manipulation replaces love, true courage lies in reclaiming agency, asserting boundaries, and taking action for the sake of personal dignity. My journey, once defined by fear, had transformed into a story of clarity, empowerment, and resilience, a testament to the strength found when one finally stops responding to threats and begins responding to truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.